Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a moment when the person who once pulled away suddenly wants you back. The same avoidant who once acted like they didn't care, who made you question your worth, who treated your love like it was too much to handle, now they're circling back. They're texting again. They're talking about memories. They're suddenly thinking about you. But before you open that door, before you let them step back into your peace, I want you to ask yourself 7 brutal questions. Because these questions aren't about revenge, they're about reality. They're the mirror you hold up to see if this time is love or just ego. Let's begin with the truth. When an avoidant comes back, it's rarely because they've healed. It's because their illusion of control has cracked. See, avoidants live by distance. They thrive on power. They feel safest when they're not emotionally dependent on anyone. But when the person who gave them unconditional love finally walks away, their ego begins to break. They start to realize that the silence they once used as protection has become their punishment. And suddenly, they miss you, not necessarily because they've grown, but because they can no longer feel that control. So before you take them back, before you hand over your heart again, ask yourself these 7 questions and answer them with brutal honesty. When an avoidant comes back, it's rarely about love, it's about losing control. Because for them, love was never the problem. It was the loss of power that terrified them. When they first walked away, they didn't feel heartbreak the way you did. They felt relief, freedom, calm. They told themselves they made the right choice, that the distance would protect them from emotional overwhelm. In their mind, pulling away wasn't abandonment, it was survival. They convinced themselves they didn't need you, didn't need anyone. But what they didn't realize was that their sense of control was built on your effort, your energy, your chase. They felt secure because they knew you cared more, tried harder, reached first. You were the one holding the connection together. So, when you finally stopped trying, when your messages stopped coming, when your silence became louder than their ego, that's when something inside them broke. Avoidants thrive on emotional distance. It's how they regulate fear. They don't want to lose you, but they don't want to be too close either. So they keep you in that fragile in-between space, close enough to feel wanted, far enough to feel safe. But when you detach, when you pull away completely, that illusion of control collapses. Suddenly, they can't predict you anymore. They can't feel your energy feeding their stability. The silence they once craved becomes unbearable. That's when the anxiety hits the same anxiety you felt when they were withdrawing. For the first time, they feel the absence of your presence, the emptiness of their own walls. They start to wonder if you've moved on, if someone else now feels the warmth they took for granted. Their ego begins to panic, not their heart, because losing emotional control feels like rejection, and rejection is the one wound their pride can't handle. When they come back, it often looks like vulnerability. They might say they've been thinking about you, that they miss you, that they realized what they lost. And part of that might even be true. But beneath those words, something else is happening. What they miss most isn't just you, it's the emotional stability your love created for them. You were their emotional anchor, even when they didn't want to admit it. You gave them validation without demanding it, affection without pressure, love without judgment. When you stop providing that, their emotional system goes into withdrawal. It's not the relationship they miss, it's the control, the certainty, the comfort of knowing someone out. There still cares enough to stay. This is why when an avoidant reaches out after time apart, it's not always a sign of growth. It's often a sign of discomfort. They're not returning to reconnect. They're returning to regain equilibrium. Your silence disrupts their emotional hierarchy. You're no longer the safe, predictable source of attention. You've become the unknown, and avoidants fear the unknown more than anything. They want to see if they can still influence your emotions. They want to know that they still matter. And when they sense they don't have that hold anymore, it shakes them. That's when they reach out, not necessarily because their heart has healed, but because their ego needs reassurance. This is where your awareness becomes your power. Because when you understand that their return isn't always about love, you stop taking it personally. You stop rushing to prove your worth, and you start observing their actions instead. You watch for accountability instead of apologies, consistency instead of charm. You look for emotional presence instead of promises. You realize that if they're back for the same reasons they left to feel safe, to feel in control, then nothing has changed except the silence between you. Love can't grow in a cycle of power. It grows in equality, in mutual vulnerability, in the willingness to face discomfort instead of running from it. An avoidance ego breaks the moment you stop being predictable. When they no longer know if you'll reply, if you'll engage, if you'll care, that's when their walls begin to crumble. It's ironic, isn't it? They spent so long fearing love because it made them feel weak, and now they're humbled by the strength of your absence, because for the first time, they can't control the outcome. They can't manipulate the timing. They can't hide behind their usual defenses. You've done the one thing they never expected. You've stopped waiting. And that's the moment they start to see that love was never their enemy. Fear was. When they come back, they're not just knocking on your door. They're testing their own reflection. They're looking for proof that they still have emotional power. But your job isn't to open that door out of sympathy or nostalgia. It's to stand in your self-worth and let them face what they've avoided all along: accountability, vulnerability, and loss of control. Because if they truly loved you, their return would be humble, consistent, and honest. But if it's driven by ego, it will always sound emotional and act detached. So when they reach out, don't fall for the nostalgia or the charm. Observe their energy. If they're back for love, you'll feel safety. If they're back for control, you'll feel confusion. And when you can tell the difference, that's when their power ends and your healing begins. I miss you doesn't always mean love. It often means, I miss feeling. Important. Those words can sound tender, honest, even redemptive, especially when they come from someone who once acted cold or distant. But when a dismissive avoidant says them, they often carry a different meaning than you think. It's not always about the depth of emotion they suddenly discovered. It's about the absence of the validation they once took for granted. Avoidants don't usually miss the relationship itself. At first, they miss the mirror that reflected their worth. They miss the emotional stability they received from being desired, from knowing someone was invested, from feeling irreplaceable in someone's eyes. It's not love that brings them back, it's ego missing the attention it lost. For a dismissive avoidant, attachment has always been confusing. They crave connection on one hand, but they fear dependence on the other. They need to feel wanted, to feel secure, yet the moment they are, they start to feel trapped. So when they walk away, or pull back, they convince themselves that they're simply protecting their independence. But something happens when the person who once chased stops chasing. The silence that follows hits deeper than they expect. The texts stop coming, the reassurance fades, and the emotional energy that once flowed toward them suddenly disappears. That's when their ego starts to ache, not their heart. They begin to realize that the emotional supply that once confirmed their importance is gone. And that's when I miss you appears not as a confession of love, but as a plea for recognition. It's not that avoidants are heartless, they just confuse love with validation. To them, being desired feels like safety. It reassures them that they matter, even when they can't connect deeply. You were their safe source of admiration, the emotional oxygen they didn't know they needed until it was gone. When you stopped giving it, they started gasping for attention, not affection. So when they reach out and say they miss you, what they really mean is they miss the feeling of being significant in your world. They miss knowing that someone cared enough to stay despite their distance. They miss being the one who mattered most, not necessarily the one who loved deeply. That's why it's dangerous to mistake their "I miss you" for a change of heart. When you hear those words, your empathy wants to believe they've finally understood your value. You want to believe they've realized your worth, that your absence made them grow. But in reality, it may just be that your absence made them uncomfortable. They're not necessarily missing you times. They're missing the version of themselves they became when you were there, the one who felt admired and emotionally significant without having to open up. You gave them a sense of importance they couldn't generate alone, and now their ego is starving for it. You can always tell the difference between love and ego by what follows. I miss you. Love is humble. It listens, takes responsibility, asks how to rebuild. Ego just wants reassurance. It seeks response, not resolution. Love asks, can I make this right? Ego says, do you still care? Love is quiet and consistent. Ego is loud and temporary. When their motive is validation, their actions will fade as soon as you give them what they came for. Once they feel seen again, they slip back into distance, because the fear that drove them away is still there. Their I miss you wasn't a bridge, it was a check to see if they still hold emotional currency in your heart. Understanding this changes everything. It helps you stop taking their words as promises. It allows you to separate sentiment from sincerity. When someone says they miss you, ask yourself what they actually miss: the connection or the control, the love or the attention. Are they reaching out to rebuild something real, or to soothe the discomfort of no longer being wanted? Most of the time, it's the latter. They miss the safety of being desired, without having to give back the same depth of emotion. They miss the comfort of your patience, your understanding, your willingness to stay while they kept you waiting. When you finally detach from an avoidant, your silence becomes their mirror. It forces them to face the emptiness they've been hiding behind self-sufficiency. And for the first time, they realize how much of their self-worth came from being needed. That's why they often return, not because they've healed, but because they want to feel important again. Their ego doesn't know how to process invisibility. It craves validation like oxygen, and your absence deprives it. But you can't feed an ego and call it love. So when they say, "I miss you," listen carefully, not to the words, but to the energy behind them. If they're missing you from a place of growth, you'll feel humility, effort, consistency. If they're missing you from ego, you'll feel urgency, confusion, and repetition. Real love doesn't miss attention, it misses connection. It doesn't crave control, it craves closeness. And the moment you stop mistaking ego hunger for emotional depth, you take your power back. Because their "I miss you" loses all control. The second you realize it isn't about you, it's about the emptiness they created within themselves. Real apology comes with accountability, not excuses. It's the difference between healing and repetition, between closure and another cycle of pain. When a dismissive avoidant comes back after disappearing, one of the most telling signs of whether they've changed or not lies in how they apologize, if they even do. Most of them don't say, "I was wrong." They say, "I didn't mean to hurt you," or "I just needed space," or "You know how I am." These aren't apologies. They're explanations wrapped in self-protection. They sound gentle, but they're designed to avoid responsibility. They speak to soothe the moment, not to rebuild trust. And that's where you need to listen carefully, not to the sweetness of their tone, but to the depth of their ownership. A real apology is not about words, it's about awareness. It's when someone can look you in the eye and name what they did, how it affected you, and why they're determined not to repeat it. It's when they stop centering their intentions and start acknowledging your pain. Avoidants struggle with that because accountability threatens their image of control. To admit they hurt you means they must admit they were emotionally careless, and for someone whose identity is built on logic and composure, that feels like failure. So they twist apologies into soft excuses. They shift the focus from your hurt to their discomfort. They might say, "You were too emotional," or "I didn't know you felt that way," or "I was just overwhelmed." But these words are deflections, not confessions. They keep the emotional balance tilted in their favor, where they stay untouchable, and you keep absorbing the blame. When an avoidant hasn't grown, their version of an apology is designed to reset the connection without addressing the wound. They want to skip the accountability and move straight to the reunion. They might message you late at night, say they've been thinking about you, maybe even admit they miss you, but notice what's missing. They never say, "I understand why you stopped trusting me." They never ask, "What can I do to make it right?" They're not trying to fix the foundation. They're trying to rebuild the illusion of closeness without effort. And because you care, because your heart remembers the good moments, it's easy to mistake that emotional breadcrumb for change. But you can't rebuild a bridge someone refuses to admit they burned. Accountability is uncomfortable, and that's why it's so powerful. When someone truly owns their behavior, they don't rush to defend it. They sit in the discomfort of your pain and let it humble them. A real apology doesn't seek to be forgiven. It seeks to understand. It doesn't focus on how bad they feel. It focuses on what you went through. You'll know it's real, not because it sounds perfect, but because it feels safe. The words align with their actions. They don't apologize one day and disappear the next. They show consistency in small ways, checking in, showing empathy, listening instead of deflecting. Accountability means change you can see, not promises you have to imagine. Avoidants struggle to reach this level of maturity because they were never taught how to handle emotional discomfort without shutting down. They equate vulnerability with danger, so when confronted, they retreat into logic. They'll rationalize, They'll intellectualize. They'll make excuses that sound calm and reasonable, but all they're doing is avoiding the emotional truth. Real love doesn't hide behind reasoning. It confronts the reality of its impact. And until an avoidant learns to do that, every apology will be a performance, not a transformation. If someone comes back and says, "I didn't mean to hurt you," but never asks how they did, that's not healing, it's habit. If they say, "Let's just move on," they're not ready to rebuild, they're trying to reset. If they act remorseful but still avoid emotional conversations, they're still protecting their ego more than your heart. Accountability is the moment when they drop the performance and start showing presence. It's when they stop minimizing your pain and start making space for it. Without that, every "I'm sorry" becomes a tool to regain comfort, not rebuild trust. You deserve an apology that doesn't just sound kind, but feels real. One that comes with empathy, ownership, and consistency. You deserve someone who doesn't explain away their behavior, but acknowledges the consequences of it. Because when someone truly loves you, they don't defend what broke you. They learn from it. They don't seek to clear their name. They seek to heal the connection. And if an avoidant returns without that humility, it's not reconciliation, it's repetition. You can't accept words from someone who refuses to carry their weight. An apology without accountability is manipulation in disguise. It gives temporary comfort, while guaranteeing future pain. But an apology with accountability, that's where change begins. That's when you can finally stop fighting for acknowledgement because it's freely given. And until an avoidant reaches that level of emotional awareness, their "I'm sorry" will always be an escape route, not a repair. When they truly mean it, you won't just hear it, you'll feel it in their patience, their effort, and their consistency. That's when you'll know the apology isn't an act of ego, it's an act of growth. You don't measure change in promises, you measure it in consistency. Because words are easy for anyone to say, especially when they want back into your life. Avoidants can sound sincere when they return. They can say all the right things, look you in the eyes, and make it sound like they've finally learned their lesson. They'll tell you they've changed, that they understand what they lost, that this time will be different. But promises are only potential, they're not proof. You can't rebuild a relationship based on what someone says they'll do. You rebuild it based on what they consistently show you when no one's watching, when emotions rise again, when fear and old patterns start to resurface. That's where truth reveals itself in repetition, not in rehearsed apologies. Avoidants are experts at temporary vulnerability. When they feel the pain of separation, they let their guard down, just enough to pull you close again. In that moment, they may even believe everything they're saying. They're not lying. They're speaking from a place of discomfort, from fear of losing the connection completely. But what they mistake for change is just emotional panic. It's the guilt, the loneliness, the emptiness that drives them to reach out. Once that feeling subsides, once they feel reassurance that you still care, the old avoidance begins again. The same fear of closeness that drove them away in the first place reawakens, and suddenly they pull back, become distant, detached, unavailable. You're left standing in the same emotional cycle, confused and drained, wondering how they could change so quickly. Consistency is the only real evidence of transformation. It's not in how they speak when they want you, it's in how they behave once they have you again. Watch what happens when vulnerability returns to the table. Do they stay engaged, or do they withdraw like before? When tension rises, do they communicate, or do they retreat into silence? When you express your needs, do they listen, or do they act defensive? Their behavior, under emotional pressure, is the truest measure of growth. Because anyone can love you in comfort, but only those who have changed can love you through discomfort. A lot of people mistake intensity for commitment. They think the strong words, the passionate apologies, the emotional outpouring mean something has shifted. But change isn't dramatic. It's steady. It's quiet. It's when the same person who used to disappear during conflict now stays to talk it through. It's when the one who used to minimize your emotions now validates them instead. It's when you no longer have to beg for effort because effort becomes natural. Change is boring when it's real. It's repetitive. It's built in daily actions that prove reliability over time. Avoidance may promise growth after the pain, but until their actions match their words, it's only emotion speaking, not evolution. When someone has truly changed, you'll feel consistency more than you'll hear it. They'll stop talking about what they'll do and start doing it without announcement. They'll rebuild trust, one act at a time, not one speech at a time. They'll stop using apologies as resets and start using accountability as repair. They won't expect instant forgiveness. They'll earn it slowly. And you won't have to chase them to show effort, they'll show it, because it matters to them now. That's what real growth looks like. It's not about perfection, it's about reliability. It's not about never slipping, it's about noticing when they do and correcting it on their own. Avoidants often confuse emotion with change because they've never been taught that emotional intensity isn't enough. They'll feel deep regret when they lose you, and in that regret, they'll believe they've evolved. But emotion is temporary, behavior is truth. Real growth takes time, reflection, and a discomfort. It requires confronting their own patterns instead of running from them. That's why you can't take promises as proof. A changed person doesn't need to convince you, they simply let their actions speak for them. So when they come back with words, take a step back and watch the patterns. Time will reveal everything. Because talk fades, consistency doesn't. If their presence remains steady after the excitement of reconnection wears off, if they keep showing up even when things get uncomfortable, that's when you know something has shifted. But if they start strong and fade back into old habits, it's not love returning, it's the cycle repeating. You don't need more promises. You need proof. You don't need emotional declarations. You need emotional consistency. Because in the end, anyone can say they've changed, but only someone who's done the real work will show it day after day, without applause, without reminders, without conditions. And that's when you know the difference between a promise meant to win you back and a transformation meant to keep you safe. The question isn't whether they've changed, it's whether you'll lose yourself again. Because every time an avoidant comes back, the temptation to believe in their transformation is strong. You remember the good moments, the connection, the softness that existed before the distance began. You want to believe that this time will be different, that the pain you endured meant something, that they've finally realized your worth. But before you give them another chance, you need to ask yourself a deeper question, not, have they changed, but, can I stay true to myself if I let them back in? Because love shouldn't require you to shrink, silence, or sacrifice your boundaries just to feel chosen. The truth is, most people lose themselves not because the other person demanded it, but because they wanted so desperately to make love work. You may have told yourself that being patient would heal them, that loving them harder would fix the fear that made them pull away. You gave them space when you were hurting. You stayed quiet when you wanted to scream. You took responsibility for both your pain and theirs, believing that if you were understanding enough, they'd see the depth of your loyalty. But that's not love, that's survival. It's trying to earn connection from someone who withholds it. And when you do that long enough, you forget what your own peace feels like. Avoidants don't ask you to lose yourself directly, they do it subtly. They reward you when you're calm and distant, and retreat when you're emotional and expressive. Over time, you learn to regulate yourself around their comfort. You start talking softer, feeling less, asking for less. You shrink yourself to fit the shape of their fear, and even when you know it's unfair, you convince yourself it's necessary to keep them close. That's how you lose yourself inch by inch, boundary by boundary, until love becomes something you have to work for, instead of something that meets you halfway. So when they come back, it's easy to get caught up in their words. They say they miss you, that they've grown, that they finally understand what they did wrong. But ask yourself, can you express your needs this time without fear of rejection? Can you be fully honest without worrying they'll pull away again? Can you stay grounded in your worth, even when they go quiet or withdraw? Because if you can't, then nothing has changed, no matter what they say. Change isn't just about their growth, it's about your boundaries. If their return requires you to go back to walking on eggshells, you're not being given another chance at love. You're being invited back into the same pattern that broke you. Real love never asks you to trade authenticity for security. You should never have to choose between being yourself and being loved. But avoidant relationships often force that choice. Their discomfort with intimacy can make you question your sensitivity, your intensity, even your kindness. You start believing you're too much, when in reality, you were just loving someone who wasn't ready to receive it. The danger in taking them back without reflection is that you'll unconsciously start dimming yourself again, hoping that this time, less of you will make them stay. But less of you isn't love, it's loss. It's losing your spark, your voice, your truth, just to keep someone who's still undecided about connection. Before you let them back, look at the version of yourself that existed when you were with them. Were you at peace, or were you constantly managing their emotions? Did you feel seen, or were you always explaining yourself? Did you feel safe, or did you live in quiet fear,